This week on The Right Side, Elizabeth May is accused of bullying. Her party says she wouldn't be if she were a man. The BC and Alberta governments spar over Trans Mountain. ICBC losing $1.3 billion will cost drivers more in insurance. And we detail the federal government's drinking problem. This is The Right Side, episode 54, recorded Saturday, February 3rd, 2018. Government's flying drunk. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for another episode of The Right Side. Patrick and myself are here once again this week in February now. Welcome back.
Yeah, we're now into February, and a new month means a lot of new news items to talk about.
Definitely. I know we're kind of snowed in here this week. You guys are probably getting ready for the spring flower counts, though that might not be yet. I don't know when that happens there, but...
Yeah, well, you're snowed in, we're rained in. You know, that's business as usual in winter for BC and Alberta, right?
Absolutely. And, you know, this week we do have a full episode, and this week is more of a traditional episode of The Right Side, going back to our origins in terms of kind of stories we'll talk about, but that's topic for just a moment. If you're wondering what The Right Side is, what we're here to do is, with this podcast, is we're going to put you on the right side of the news by providing you with the context and information that you might not get from the mainstream media, or might just be sorely missed by the mainstream media and the stories that we talk about. And that's our objective.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a lot of bias and sensationalism that you find in a lot of stories in the mainstream media, and we try and cut that out and try to give you just the straight news. And a lot of the times you'll have to go to a bunch of different sources just to find the one story and find out all the details about a certain news item. So we definitely put all those together for you and make sure that you get the full context of what we're actually talking about.
Indeed, and I think it makes good sense to start off with Canada this week and talk about someone who really isn't talked about all that much, though she has a big name and big personality.
That is very true, and that is none other than Elizabeth May, who is the Green Party's sole MP in Ottawa, of course, hailing from Saanich Gulf Islands here on the island. And it turns out that the Green Party is defending her from accusations of bullying from former employees. And the Green Party had a very interesting defense for this as well. They argued that she wouldn't be criticized for similar behavior if she were a man. Now, the allegations come from 3 former employees who accuse May of creating a hostile work environment by yelling at employees and putting them down in front of colleagues. So Rob Rayner, who is one of the accusers who spoke to the Canadian press, he was an interim executive director at the party for 7 months in 2014. And he said coming forward with his experience was important because he continued to hear that other staffers were being bullied. And he also said that the timing also seemed right as the hashtag #MeToo movement highlights workplace misconduct. And the Green Party, of course, was swift to defend May just hours after the story was published in the Toronto Star. Now, the Green Party statement said that the 63-year-old party leader was being, quote, held to a different standard than male leaders. The full quote says, a man with these qualities is being admired for his leadership. A woman is portrayed as overbearing and bullying. These outdated gender stereotypes have no place in 21st century Canada.
Now, let's just be clear here. Anyone who is yelling at their staff and using an aggressive tone and being overall intimidating, whether that person be male or female, is bullying.
Yeah, it doesn't matter what gender you are, who you are. If you're yelling at someone or making them uncomfortable in the workplace, that's bullying no matter who you are, basically. And as Scott Thompson of Global News writes, he says, quote, does anyone else find this smug considering the climate of late surrounding behavior accountability? He said, a man with these qualities is admired for his leadership since when? What rock are they under? Have they not seen the news in the last year? Bullying is bad no matter what the gender. So that was his take on this story. And given our story last week of all the allegations going around of sexual assault, by other politicians, it's very clear that we have to take any allegations seriously and then create due process for the accused and make sure that things are treated with the respect that they deserve. Now, a few days after the story hit national media, the Green Party has hired an outside lawyer, Sheila Block of the Toronto-based law firm Torys LLP, to investigate the allegations, which is an inquiry that May actually requested herself. She also brushed off complaints as being from people that just didn't like her as a person. She said, quote, "These three individuals have created a caricature of me that bears no resemblance to reality. I don't want to be standing in front of a microphone and talking about individuals and whether or not I remembered to bring them flowers." So that's a very interesting thing to say in response, right?
That
Now,
makes no sense as an analogy, but okay.
yeah, exactly, right? Now, she later stated, quote, "Although it grieves me to say it, the hundreds of people who have worked for me over the years and the thousands of people I've met in my work, both at the Sierra Club and in the Green Party, not everybody likes me. And that's okay. I accept that. It's life." So she's basically trying to say that these things have no base in reality and that they're just coming from people that are disgruntled from either leaving the party or that they just didn't like her as a person. Now, she said that she expects that the lawyer's probe will take 2 to 4 weeks and that the findings will be publicly released. But one of May's accusers questioned whether the investigation would be truly independent, given that the lawyer was hired by the Green Party, or whether the report will actually be released to the public in its entirety. Now, as we said on last week's episode, an allegation is unproven, and certainly it is possible that Elizabeth May is innocent of these actions. Fine, but the bigger issue here is not the allegation itself, it's actually how the party defended May by playing the gender card and saying that she was innocent simply because as a woman she is being held to a higher standard. And as Emma Title of the Star writes, quote, "The Green Party statement above reads to me like a political party's attempt to co-opt feminist ideology in order to make excuses for its leaders' allegedly cruel behavior. May, a woman accused of workplace misconduct, is in the unique position of being able to use sexism to her advantage to deflect blame." Now, keeping in mind that was a woman writing that, it seems very much that there seems to be a bit of a double standard in how things are being portrayed in the media.
This is the complete opposite of what we saw last week. And, we'll say it again. The allegations against the three individuals we talked about could be true. They could not be true. And that's something that the courts are going to need to decide. But as you can see here, these are also bullying allegations. Granted, they're not as serious as the allegation from last week, but it's a completely different tone about that. And I don't know if that comes down to the fact it's the Green Party or it's Elizabeth May, but nonetheless, it's something I think that everyone should be paying attention to. As we said, that is the climate that we're in today. So I don't know who to pin the blame on for this, either Elizabeth May or the Green Party. And maybe that's something the members of the Green Party need to think about at their next convention to determine if they were happy with the way that this probe will ultimately roll out.
Yeah, exactly. Now, it's been mentioned that in 2016 there was a leadership review of Elizabeth May, and apparently 94% of Green Party members approved of her as being leader. So there is definitely some merit in her thoughts that it may just be disgruntled former employees. But I think the real problem here is how they defended the allegations by saying that because she's a woman, she has different standards. And I think everyone, when it comes to things like bullying or workplace harassment, they should all be held to the same standard, and that for no one is it okay to do those sorts of things.
Definitely.
And I think that's something that's being missed in the media. They've been talking about the defense, but a lot of people haven't been talking about just how weird of a statement that actually was. And you could actually read that statement right on the Green Party website. It is still up for viewing.
Yeah, and I mean, perhaps there's also the difference in optics from the media because let's face it, the Green Party in Canada is never going to be forming an actual government, and unless the system changes, they're highly unlikely to become the holders of power, as unlike how they are in BC. So it kind of makes sense as to why the story was glossed over, but nonetheless, the complete opposite reporting on it is really disappointing because all allegations like this should be taken seriously and investigated to their full extent, which, I think given the Green Party carrying it out here, that might not be happening in this case. But as always here on the right side, we'll just have to wait and see.
That's for sure, and we'll have to see how the results come out, and we'll let you know if there's something surprising that comes out of it.
Definitely. All right, we're going to continue talking a little bit about BC now, except this is going to be largely talking about BC here from the Alberta perspective and what Alberta needs to do to get its resources to market, because as we talked about before, we are seeing an increase in the world price of oil, but unfortunately, given our inability to get the product to market and the supply surplus that we have here in Alberta, we're unable to get the world market price for our oil. And BC isn't helping us this week, because this week the BC government ultimately raised the level of rhetoric in the ongoing BC-Alberta pipeline dispute. And this is indeed, of course, referring to Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain Pipeline project that was given approval by the federal government. It did receive its environmental approval as well from the National Energy Board. So this is a project that has been approved across the board from policy all the way up to the Prime Minister himself, and yet the BC government here is still stalling it. This week, the BC government said that if the pipeline is complete, they will place a limit on the amount of diluted bitumen that can be transported until the province can, quote, better understand the ability to manage spill. So basically what this means is that, this pipeline can be built, but even if it's built, we're going to put a limit on how much can be transported until we're satisfied that a spill will be able to be managed properly. And of course, this is loosely translated into, well, we're really going to hold up the oil that comes through so it's not going to get to market because we want this project to ultimately not go through. And this actually comes from BC Environment Minister George Heyman, because he said British Columbians rightfully expect their government to defend BC's coastline and our inland waterways and the economic and environmental interests that are so important to the people in our province, and we are working hard to just do that. And, if the BC government were to do this, this would effectively make the project economically infeasible. And we saw what happened to pipeline projects that are declared to be economically unfeasible by their parent company. In this case, the one I'm thinking about right now is the Energy East pipeline. It was going to head east towards Quebec. Now, Andrew Weaver, the leader of the Green Party in BC, jumped on his Twitter machine and commended that move by the BC Environment Minister. This in turn spurred Alberta Premier Rachel Notley to spring into action in the defense of the project. She said the government of BC is now grasping at straws, and she also rightly states that the BC government could cost thousands of jobs by delaying the project or, as I mentioned, potentially causing its cancellation. And that's exactly what happened with Energy East. Now, this has the potential to ignite an all-out trade war between Alberta and BC because, that is the way a province has to respond when someone else, BC in this case, is doing something that is clearly unconstitutional, because natural resources and pipelines that cross borders are the federal government's jurisdiction. That could very well ignite an all-out trade war between Alberta and BC. And, this is something that Jason Kenney talked about last summer, that there would be consequences for BC if this were to happen, or if the pipeline was delayed or canceled due to the BC government. And, at the time when we were talking about this, the media and the NDP laughed at him for this. And here we are today with Rachel Notley considering possibly taking the province of BC to court over this. So far, the court case has been suggested, but also the suspension of negotiations with BC over electricity sales. And of course, the province of Alberta could ultimately go further with this and limit the amount of gas shipped to BC. And we all know what this would do to gas prices in BC, in the Lower Mainland and on the island. And I hear you're chuckling right now because...
It's already one of the highest in Western Canada for sure, and it just happens to be that way partially because there's a carbon tax on it as well. So that's something that we'll have to talk about in the next story after this, of course.
So, Justin Trudeau is also doing his town hall tour, and this week he made it all the way out west to Edmonton and Nanaimo later in the week. And he confirmed his commitment to the project by saying, "We're going to just reiterate that the decision was made in the national interest, and we're going to move forward with that decision, which means we're going to get the Trans Mountain Pipeline built." And this is the most that we have ever heard Justin Trudeau come down on the side of this pipeline, or any pipeline in general, being this assertive and this affirmative on that project. Now, this ultimately drew the ire of those at the Nanaimo town hall, having Trudeau being booed and two environmentalists having to be removed from the room by police. Suffice to say, the project wasn't very well received at Trudeau's Nanaimo town hall. And at this town hall, Trudeau lost his composure, which is extremely rare for the PM. And in an angry tone, he said, come on, really? Really, this is it? Will you respect the people in this room? And I can't do it justice, but I think this is the first time I ever heard Prime Minister Trudeau angry to this degree.
Well, I've heard him angry in the House of Commons when he was in opposition before, of course. There was that time where he called one of the Conservative members a piece of a piece of blank. And there certainly have been times where he's been angry before, but definitely not as the Prime Minister.
Yeah, and not in public.
Now, he's definitely lost his composure when he's made speeches, of course. There's definitely been numerous times where he's made a lot of mistakes and then it's kind of flustered him. But this is definitely one of the first times as a prime minister where he's actually gone angry while talking to the Canadian public.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's definitely something.
And after this, and after the room was calmed down, he detailed the compromise in question about the pipeline. And he said that the pipeline will be built, but will also require a focus on climate change with the carbon tax and spill prevention programs. And he reiterated that both the action on climate change, the carbon tax, and the spill prevention programs are dependent on the pipeline being built, and that there will be no ducking out of any of the three conditions of this compromise. So Trudeau is basically saying to BC, if you guys want the carbon tax and you guys want increased spill protection, you need to okay this pipeline before any of that will happen. And I think that makes sense because the best deal is one where no one is happy. And that's what we got in this case here. Now, So while Trudeau is taking the diplomatic approach today in his town halls when talking to the public, the battle lines for 2019 in BC are already being drawn and potentially throughout the rest of the country. Those who are opposed to the Trans Mountain Pipeline in BC won't vote for Trudeau. And the federal NDP have already sought to capitalize on this by issuing a shadow cabinet shuffle. And this shows that the NDP sees a shift westward to focus on BC. And that's where they think the 2019 battle will be and where they can gain the most. And, since 2011, the NDP has been largely focused on Quebec, and this marks a shift back towards their traditional dominance out in BC. And we'll have to see how that pans out because this is ultimately a pretty big deal because at the end of the day, BC MP Nathan Cullen, who was previously ethics critic, is effectively going to become the BC lieutenant for the party. And at this point, given Jagmeet Singh's recent performance in the federal by-elections, the federal NDP needs all the help they can get to maintain some level of relevance, and they might just do that in BC.
Yeah, and I think that something that's very important to note here on this is that in the 2015 election, the Liberals made a huge inroads into the Lower Mainland by electing MPs in a lot of places where the Conservatives and the NDP were actually expected to win the seats. Now, we saw back in the provincial election just last year that in Burnaby especially, where a lot of the focus on Trans Mountain was going to be, no district in Burnaby actually elected the BC Liberal member who, of course, the BC Liberals were on board with the Trans Mountain Pipeline and they were going to try and get it done. And that was a huge cost on the election, of course, because the BC Liberals ended up being out of power to begin with. So this is this is a huge decision, and if Trudeau keeps going on with this pipeline, there is going to be a chance that he's going to lose a lot of seats in BC that he actually just won back in the 2015 election.
Precisely. And, there's also one final note here for Alberta on this. And, any delays or any potential issues with trade between Alberta, BC, or perhaps even the cancellation of this project by Kinder Morgan could ultimately see the BC NDP guaranteeing the defeat of the Alberta NDP in next year's election. And there was actually a story in the Calgary Herald about this, that with these actions today, it's entirely possible that the BC NDP could have sealed the fate of the Alberta NDP. And, Rachel Notley is doing all she can with this. She's taking from Jason Kenney's 2017 summer playbook and implementing it when it comes to dealing with BC. But if the pipeline faces delays or is not built, she will ultimately feel the repercussions of this because, after all, the carbon tax, or at least we were told by her government here in Alberta, is that the carbon tax was supposed to get a social license. That is the goodwill from the province and from the environmentalists to build pipelines. But, if we're not getting this, then what's the point of the carbon tax? And people are going to start thinking about that back here in Alberta. And, it all comes back to the strong, stable minority government also in BC, because what if Andrew Weaver also steps in with this and continues to ratchet up the rhetoric? So
That's true.
Very interesting.
And we definitely know that Andrew Weaver's very good at ratcheting up rhetoric, as we talked about in the last couple weeks. And you can definitely be sure that he'll be on any side that will be against pipelines as well, being on the Green Party. And who knows if he will make this an issue as whether he will keep propping up the NDP minority government if they wanted to go for it anyways, because we saw that threat over Site C and with the LNG industry as well. So it's very clear that if the NDP actually went for this pipeline here, that they might not be in government. So this might be where they make their stand.
No, it's just really I don't think I can remember a single issue in BC that has had so many potential repercussions on the federal level, on the provincial level in BC, and ultimately reverberating here over into Alberta as well. I can't think of a single issue that has done that in BC.
Yeah, and it's something that is not easy to understand, especially outside of the Lower Mainland and the island here, but people here really do not like pipelines, or just even the thought of pipelines, no matter where on earth they will be. So, and that is something that does motivate voters to vote for a certain party. And that was one of the reasons why the shift went towards the NDP and the Green Party especially here on the South Island. And that was one of the huge major issues of the last election here provincially. And that's why we're seeing all this happen. We know that elections will change policy for sure, just depending on who gets elected. We've seen this in the States, where a huge dramatic political shift has changed a lot of the way that things work down in the States. We definitely saw this in 2015 with the election of the Liberals, and we'll be continuing to see this in other places as well.
Elections have consequences. Get out there and vote, get educated, and vote for the party that best represents you.
That's for sure.
All right, what do you got for BC? Because that could have been a BC story, but there's actually other things happening in BC this week.
That's true. So back in late August 2017 on episode 33, I briefly mentioned a story about ICBC, ICBC standing for the Insurance Corporation of BC. Now, they're the Crown Corporation that covers all basic auto insurance coverage for drivers. And I talked about how back then it was in financial trouble. Now, it was suggested back then that the Crown Corporation would need to raise car insurance rates on everyone by $130 per year just to balance the book sheets. Now, just over 7 months later, and we have actually gotten the news that ICBC is projected to lose $1.3 billion in just the previous fiscal year alone. So now on top of the previous rate hikes, rates will have to be raised by another $400 per year just to break even. Now the average cost to drivers per year in 2017 was around $14.50 already, which is higher than all the other provinces, as BC just in the last year has leapt over Ontario to take the top spot on the list. Now, it should be noted at this point that ICBC was originally created in 1973 by the brief 3-year NDP government of 1972 to 1975. Now, that was originally to keep car insurance costs low. However, over time, especially in the last few years, rates have slowly crept up and up until we've gotten to this point today. Now, back in the summer, Attorney General David Eby had this to say, quote, ICBC is one of British Columbia's most important assets. That said, there are deep and profound issues at our public insurer that need to be addressed immediately in order to keep rates affordable for British Columbians in the long term. We need to take drastic action to fix ICBC's devastating current financial situation. And this was propped up by reports at the time. Now, a July 2017 report from Ernst & Young painted a dire picture at the Crown Corporation, concluding that rates must increase by 30% by 2019 to cover costs. Now, a separate forecast released last November by ICBC indicated rates would need to increase by 42% over the next 5 years just to make for expenses. So it seems that even though they were needing to take drastic action to fix the financial situation, it seems that they have not fixed the problem yet. Now, the shocking losses are actually much higher than was projected just 3 months ago, when the fiscal year-end loss was pegged at around $200 million. The briefing note by ICBC to Eby says that, quote, the dramatic increase in losses has been driven by the emergence of many large, extremely costly claims. Many claims originally classified by ICBC as minor have emerged as more complex and costly files known as, quote, large loss claims. A category that has grown 80% in the past year alone, and which cost an average of $450,000 each to settle. Now, the report called on the government to impose a cap on large court-ordered financial awards paid to victims who suffer, quote, minor soft issue injuries like whiplash in auto crashes. And BC is the only province in Canada where such awards are still unlimited. Now, when asked if privatization of ICBC was a possible solution to the financial troubles, Eby brushed aside the notion that operating efficiencies and cheaper rates might emerge from competition with private insurers, which, as we see in most of the provinces across Canada, only BC, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and partly Quebec have public insurance options, and most of the private insurance operations, other than Ontario, are actually much cheaper.
And that gives a sense to shop around too. And, anytime you bring the private market into it, that lowers prices for the people, but it also unshackles the government from having to deal with this huge loss as a Crown Corporation, because, that's the term Crown Corporation, is that it's run as its own corporate entity, sure, but ultimately when it comes down to it, it gets most of its funding from the government and is accountable to that government. And the government really shouldn't be in business on these huge levels like this.
Indeed. Now, it's been also mentioned that since they're losing this much money, that there might be a cash bailout from the upcoming budget. But apparently that's also off the table, as Eby believes that it would just be a short-term solution and wouldn't actually fix the problem, which is correct. However, the massive ICBC losses have actually left finance ministry officials scrambling ahead of the provincial budget, which is presented on February 20th by Finance Minister Carol James. Now, James had originally promised that this budget would be a balanced budget, but apparently they're now studying the, quote, implications of the ICBC losses on the commitment. So they're trying to avoid the same perceived mistakes as the BC Liberals did, where they had surpluses in their last budgets, and they thought that if they had spent those surpluses on social programs, that the BC Liberals would still be in power. So they're So now the NDP are trying to do the same thing, whereas they're trying to weigh the political capital of having a balanced budget over having a $400 per year average increase for drivers, which would definitely not go down well with most of the British Columbian populace. So what apparently is going to happen, supposedly, is a crackdown on distracted driving, which is generally people using handheld devices while they're driving their cars. There's also going to be a higher use of red light cameras to stop people from running red lights. And there's also going to be merit-based rates where drivers with a bad record will face higher basic premiums from ICBC. Now, currently, everyone basically pays much the same rate through ICBC, and then for the optional insurance, that's where you can get lower rates. So with higher insurance rates on the horizon and ever more expensive gas rates, it seems that operating a car is becoming more and more of a luxury every day. And if you factor in the insane housing prices, well, that's just seen as a very expensive trade-off to living in beautiful British Columbia, it seems.
And that also helps to further the social narrative that we can have higher rates on car use and whatnot, and maybe more people will use those bike lanes we talked about a couple of weeks ago. So,
yeah, or the transportation or the public transportation systems that don't actually exist. So, for more on that, to go back a couple of weeks ago where we talked about the municipal issues in Victoria and all that sort of thing.
There's a general trend here, and this general trend is to, you end up with a government that balances the budget before they leave, as happened with the federal government, and then the incoming government spends, and puts them into deficit. And, BC, I remember we talked about whether or not the BC budget was going to be balanced before the election, and it turns out it was based on this. And the NDP are going to need to decide if they want to go down that same route. And the second thing is that what we're seeing here is we're seeing a government bureaucracy that is becoming increasingly entangled with managing things that the private sector could ultimately manage better, because as we see, the government on its own has problems managing its environment side with the pipelines. It also has problems here managing the insurance crown corporation too. So there's one of those things that can be passed off to someone else for potential savings and money. And I think the choice of what to do here is quite obvious, because who are people going to look to when they see a $400 rate hike on their insurance?
They're going to look right to the government, because they're going to see that that's ICBC, and everyone in BC equates ICBC to the provincial government. Like, that is just the public perception out there. And so they're going to see all those rates going up, and they have seen it going up, and they're going to think government should be doing something about this. So this is going to be something that the government's really going to have to tread quite lightly on this issue in order to be able to fix it and to be able to cause the public perception that they're doing something to fix it. Because so far, since they have taken power, that has not seemingly been the case. And so that's going to be something they're going to have to correct in the public perception if they want to keep public goodwill on their side.
And it's very early in the mandates. We'll just have to wait and see how this pans out. And, that is a recurring theme here on the right side. We were talking about this in post shows, that there's so many things we just leave off on that we don't have answers to right now, that we're going to have to look at some point in the future. And we probably said the same thing with ICBC last summer. And here we are in February looking at it again. So, all right.
Indeed.
Firing line. We had a really serious firing line last week with something that was getting coverage in the media, and we wanted to shine a bit of a different light on it. But this week we're going to be using our firing line segment to talk about a story that hasn't really been talked about anywhere. It was talked about in one article in the National Post, and that is one of the perks of flying on the federal government aircraft. 400 bottles of wine on the plane. That is the headline we're dealing with here today in the firing line segment, with the subheading, Federal Politicians Have Access to Limitless Alcohol on Government Flights. And let's just step back for a minute and realize that to fly privately, you are going to pay a good deal of money. It can cost you anywhere between $400 to $600 to fly on a very simple flight, even from just Edmonton to Calgary, and probably anywhere between $500 and $900 to fly from Edmonton to Vancouver, for example. So flying is not something that's cheap for most of us. And even when you do fly on these economy air carriers, WestJet or Air Canada, within Canada, the best you can hope for is a drink or a coffee, right? A free can of pop or maybe some pretzels along the way. And that's the most normal people can hope for when they fly around Canada. But over the span of 1 year, from December 2016 through December 2017, those who flew on government aircraft consumed 401 bottles of wine, 584 cans of beer, and 5 250 milliliter bottles of vodka. The total cost for this, $8,179. And during the recent government trip to China this past December, which was arranged very quickly, you'll remember we talked about that and Trudeau coming home with nothing from China. Well, on that trip alone, $2,200 worth of alcohol was consumed. That's 121 bottles of wine, 241 cans of beer. And with this, there were 56 passengers on these flights, and doing the math, that's roughly 2 bottles of wine and 4 cans of beer for each passenger on a flight with around 56 people to and from to China over the span of 1 week. Let's just appreciate the magnitude there. 2 bottles of wine and 4 cans of beer for each passenger.
I guess if you're coming home from China and you were expecting a trade deal and you didn't get a trade deal, that probably leads you to drink, right? Especially when it's reported in the media that you're not doing anything. Sure, yeah, you'd probably want to pick up the wine and the beer, right?
You would think that this has gotten better, but it actually gets worse. During the trip to Vietnam in November, 50 people drank 76 bottles of wine and 79 cans of beer worth $1,685. Limitless alcohol has also been available on government flights since the 1970s, and this is something that isn't really talked about. Now, a relatively low, and this is key, relatively low amount of consumption occurred this past summer in July when former Governor General David Johnston traveled to China. There were 40 passengers on that flight, and they drank just, and this was in the wording here in the article, they drank just 33 bottles of wine and 27 cans of beer. So for those keeping tab, that's less than 1 per person, and this came in at $632. So that's the low amount for a government trip. 33 bottles of wine and 27 cans of beer. And these numbers might seem high to you, but they go even higher. In 2013, $13,605 was spent on in-flight alcohol. In 2014, $12,696 was spent on in-flight alcohol. And, we could keep detailing the spending account of the federal government on its alcohol, but I think we all get the point here. The government ultimately has a drinking problem up when they're up in the air. Because what normal person in Canada is going to be flying around and consume, on average, 2 bottles of wine on a 6-day trip to China?
Yeah, I don't know if anyone...
And 4 cans of beer.
For anyone who's drunk, had a lot of alcohol before, if you have 2 bottles of wine just on your own in one sitting, that's quite a bit.
Well, I mean, it was over 6 days, but still...
And just to think that it was this is also an average, so clearly there's some people that would drink less, and then you have to think that there's people that would actually drink more than that, maybe 3 or 4. Like, that's still quite a bit. And the fact that this is all coming back to taxpayers, I think, is something else as well. And we all talk about government waste and how bureaucracy is taking a lot of things. Well, this is a very tangible example of something that's very, very real and very much going to the politicians just purely based for their benefit, and that's coming right from the taxpayers. And this is what our tax dollars are paying for.
Right.
People.
Could you imagine if you were flying around Canada on business and you were, flying, around enough that you were up in the air for, 6 days in a row, and you somehow managed to consume 2 bottles of wine and 4 cans of beer during that time, and the amount of money that would cost you going towards Air Canada or WestJet?
Oh, yeah, that would be quite a bit.
Normal people in the public do not have this kind of money. But of course, because it comes from the federal government, it's taxpayers' money, and it's just been seen as a convenience since the 1970s. And, I wish that this week was a quieter news week so that this story could have been surfaced a little bit more. But, National Post was really the only place to mention this. And this came from actually a response and question period, because back in December, MP Dean Allison asked these questions and received the data this week on the government's alcohol consumption. So, I mean, it's something that was asked by an MP, and we have to give Dean Allison, who I believe is from the Niagara region, credit for asking this and shining a light on this issue. And it's also worth noting that in the initial report from the National Post, they did not include the totals for the 2 years of the former Harper government. Those were added in after the fact. And, I guess it's good to have that, because, you would think that maybe the other government would have been more prudent with spending. But this obviously has been an issue going back all the way to the 1970s, as we see. So this is definitely something I think that the government should make themselves accountable to, and people who are flying on these flights should be paying out of their own pocket for this, because I don't think it's fair to taxpayers to be paying over $8,000 in the course of 1 year, this past year, on the government's alcohol when they're flying around the world conducting business.
Yeah, that's for sure. I don't know if there's anything else we can say about that. Just that it's definitely very clear, as you said, that they've got a drinking problem.
Yeah, and that's also what we can do in Firing Line. We can have our very baffling segments, and this just has to be one of them. So
that's for sure.
All right, what do we got for Word of the Week?
Yeah, I think that takes us nicely into Word of the Week, which this week is the word rhetoric. Now, rhetoric is defined as the language designed to have a persuasive or impressive effect on its audience, but often regarded as lacking in sincerity or meaningful content. And the quote from this is, quote, "All we have from the opposition is empty rhetoric." So we definitely have seen a lot of empty rhetoric and just general rhetoric with all of our stories this week, with the Green Party producing a lot of rhetoric on the different gender standards in defending Elizabeth May from bullying accusations. And we've definitely seen a lot of rhetoric in the BC government spat with the Alberta government over the pipeline. And we've definitely seen a lot of interesting rhetoric over who's to blame for the ICBC losses, with the NDP and the BC Liberals trying to blame each other for it. And definitely some interesting news out of the alcohol consumption on the government flights as well. So that is our word of the week this week, rhetoric.
I don't think there's any rhetoric that could spin that one to be positive, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's for sure. There's no way they could drink themselves out of that one, for sure.
Oh boy.
Now that's something that we definitely don't do here on the right side, and that is rhetoric. We will always give you the straight side of the news. We will make sure that you have the context to keep you in the know about what's going on in Canada.
That's right. And if you want to find full show notes for this episode, you can do that at rightsidenews.ca. We're also on iTunes and YouTube at rightsidenews.ca/iTunes and rightsidenews.ca/YouTube. And if you want to follow us on social media for all these shows and whatever we're looking at throughout the week, just head on over to Twitter and Facebook. We're on Twitter at RightSideCA and on Facebook at facebook.com/RightSideCA. And with that being said, we'll see you next week for another episode of The Right Side.
And we will strive to keep you in the context of the news and make sure that we remove all the bias and sensationalism that we find and able to give you the best context possible. So with that, we will see you next week, and have a good week, everybody.